I never asked for trouble. I just wanted to enjoy my little slice of peace at my home. One of the only non-cookie cutter houses in this HOA-controlled suburb stood out like a defiant burst of color in a sea of beige. Where my neighbors had identical, soulless patches of grass, my yard was alive. Rows of hydrangeas, sunflowers stretching toward the sky, and a winding brick path that led to my front door. And in the middle of it all stood Gus, my garden gnome, but he wasn't just any gnome. Gus had been in my family for decades, a gift from my grandfather, who had immigrated here and taught me that a garden was more than decoration. It was a sanctuary. His little red hat was chipped, his blue coat faded, but to me he was familyed out. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. From the moment I moved in, I could feel the eyes on me. The kind of looks that lingered too long, as if trying to figure out how someone like me, black, young, and clearly uninterested in blending in, had ended up here. And no one made her disapproval more obvious than Karen Whitmore. Karen was the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, a woman who wore pastel cardigans like armor and patrolled the neighborhood as if she were a warden keeping the riffraff in check. She lived across the street in a house so pristine it looked like a showroom with no signs of life. No flowers, no decorations, just a lawn so aggressively sterile it looked artificial. I'd caught her glaring at my house more than once, watching me as I pruned my roses, side-eyeing my wind chimes, pursing her lips whenever she passed Gus. And then came the first warning that a formal HOA complaint, neatly typed and delivered to my mailbox. Dear homeowner, it has come to our attention that your front yard is in violation of HOA aesthetic standards. Per Section 4B, decorative ornaments deemed excessive or unsightly must be removed. Excessive? Unsightly? I looked across the street at Karen's house and saw her watching that I wasn't stupid. This wasn't about aesthetic standards. This was about control. About her deciding who got to exist comfortably in this neighborhood that I tossed the letter in the trash. And for a while, that was the end of it. I went about my life, tending to my garden, waving at the neighbors who weren't actively trying to police my existence. But then one morning, as I stepped outside, something was wrong. Gus was gone and I stared at the empty patch of soil where he'd stood for years. My heart pounded at a prank, a mistake, and then, across the street, I saw Karen. Smiling, I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the empty spot where Gus had been. The air was still, too still, like the moment before a storm. My garden, normally a haven of color and life, suddenly felt violated. I scanned the yard, as if Gus might have wandered off on his own. But he was gone. No sign of him. No sign of a struggle. And then I turned toward Karen's house. She stood on her porch, coffee cup in hand, watching, her lips curled into a smug little smirk before she turned and disappeared inside, as if nothing had happened. Why stomach twisted. Did she take him? It was ridiculous, right? Who steals a garden gnome? I forced a breath and shook off the thought. Maybe it was some bored teenager messing around. Maybe the wind knocked him over and someone moved him. There had to be a logical explanation. But as the day went on, the feeling only got worse. At the grocery store, I caught whispers. Neighbors chatting near the produce aisle, glancing at me before quickly looking away at the coffee shop. The barista, an older black woman, leaned in as she handed me my latte. You good, baby? Heard some folks talking about your yard. That confirmed it. People knew something. By the time I got home, the sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the street. I spotted Karen and her usual clique of HOA loyalists standing in her driveway, their voices low, their eyes flicking toward my house. I stepped out of my car, closing the door harder than necessary. Their conversation stopped that I could feel them watching me, but no one said a word. Just the occasional smirk, the whispered joke, the kind of condescending glances that weren't just about a garden gnome. This was something deeper, something uglier. I walked up my porch steps, each footfall heavy. Before going inside, I cast one last glance at Karen. She was still smirking, and that's when I knew this wasn't random. Gus didn't just go missing. He was taken, and Karen, she wanted me to know it. I wasn't about to let this slide. The next morning, I marched across the street, knocking firmly on Karen's door. Not aggressive, but not friendly either. The kind of knock that said, "We both know why I'm here." Karen took her time answering. When she finally did, she opened the door, just enough to peer out, a tight-lipped smile plastered on her face. She already knew what I was going to say. "Oh, good morning," she chirped, voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Can I help you?" I got straight to the point. "Karen, I'm missing something from my yard. Gus, my garden gnome. I have a feeling you know where he is." Her brows lifted in exaggerated surprise. "Oh my, a garden gnome? How tragic." She let out a condescending laugh. I did notice your yard looked a little less cluttered today. Maybe that's for the best. It was starting to look like a flea market." I clenched my jaw. She wanted a reaction. "Karen," I said evenly. "Did you take him?" She gasped, pressing a hand to her chest. "Me? Are you seriously accusing me of theft?" She glanced over my shoulder, making sure her little audience, 2 HOA board members conveniently standing in her driveway, could hear point one of them, a man named Richard, chuckled. A private joke shared between them. Karen sighed dramatically. "Look, I don't know where your little lawn ornament went, but if it did disappear, maybe someone thought it didn't fit our community aesthetic." Community aesthetic. There was the same coded language she'd been using since I moved in. Too colorful. Too different. Too much. The wrong kind of homeowner. I took a slow breath. "If I find out you took him, we're going to have a serious problem." Karen's eyes glinted with amusement. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You really think anyone's going to care about a missing gnome?" And just like that, she shut the door in my face, pushing back I wasn't going to play her game that I spend the next few hours knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen Gus. Most people gave me sympathetic shrugs. Some muttered about not wanting to get involved. But I wasn't alone. Mrs. Patel, an elderly Indian woman who'd lived here for decades, pulled me aside. "Karen's been bragging about cleaning up the neighborhood lately. Wouldn't be surprised if she had something to do with it." Then there was Jordan, the teenager who lived 3 houses down. He hesitated before speaking, but finally muttered, "I saw some HOA people over there late last night. I didn't see what they took, but yeah." That was enough for me. I checked my doorbell camera footage, hoping it caught something. Nothing. But Karen's house had security cameras. If she took Gus, her own system might have recorded it. That I needed proof. Karen doubles down the next morning. Another letter appeared in my mailbox. "Dear homeowner, your yard is in further violation of HOA standards. Per Section 6A, excessive decorations, including but not limited to lawn ornaments, must be removed. Failure to comply will result in fines." I stared at the paper. She was trying to make sure Gus was gone for good. And the kicker? The fine amount was handwritten at the bottom. $500. Karen's way of twisting a knife. That I stormed across the street again, ignoring the smug looks from Karen's little circle. This time, I wasn't alone. Mrs. Patel, Jordan, and even a few other neighbors who'd had enough of Karen's power trip followed me. I pounded on her door. Harder this time. She opened it, feigning surprise. "Oh my, again? This is becoming a habit." I held up the letter. "You think this is going to scare me?" Karen smiled, tilting her head. "It's just the rules. You understand, don't you?" I stepped forward. "You stole my gnome." She sighed dramatically. "Still on about that?" "My goodness, it's just a tacky little. He's not just a decoration," I snapped. The heat in my voice made her flinch. For the first time, she looked uncertain. "You think you can do whatever you want?" I continued, voice steady. "You think you could decide what belongs in this neighborhood and what doesn't? But you're wrong." Karen's jaw tightened, but she quickly recovered, letting out a dry chuckle. "Prove it." Challenge accepted. That I was done playing nice. That if she wanted to pretend she didn't have Gus, I was going to make her wish she'd never touched him. That I don't back down. Not for bullies. Not for people like Karen, who think their entitlement makes them untouchable. Why now? I know she stole Gus. I don't have proof yet, but that's about to change. That I spend the afternoon making calls, pulling in favors. It turns out Karen's own arrogance is her downfall. The HOA meeting. Her grand stage Karen doesn't just rule from her front porch. She craves an audience. That's why I know she'll be at tonight's HOA meeting, standing at the front of the community center, basking in the attention of her cronies. And that's exactly where I confront her. The room is packed. Folding chairs lined in stiff rows, the smell of stale coffee lingering in the air. HOA meetings are usually dull, but tonight, people are here for the show. Karen stands at the front, a smug grin plastered on her face as she flips through her notes. She has no idea what's coming. Before we begin, she announces, I'd like to address ongoing community concerns regarding non-compliant properties. She doesn't say my name, but her eyes flick toward me. A few board members chuckle that I stay silent. Let her dig her own grave. Now, some of you may have noticed an improvement in our neighborhood aesthetics, she continues. A certain excess of yard clutter has been removed, making our community a more respectable place to live. A murmur ripples through the crowd. Not everyone agrees with her, but she's counting on their silence. Then she smiles. And to ensure we maintain this standard, we'll be issuing fines for any remaining violations, including she glances at me, reappearance of unsightly lawn ornaments. There it is. She thinks she's one that I clear my throat. Karen, just curious, where exactly do you think my unsightly lawn ornament is now? She feigns confusion. Oh, I wouldn't know. Perhaps it was disposed of properly by a concerned neighbor. A few people chuckle. She thinks this is funny that I smile. That's interesting, because I did a little digging. And guess what I found? Karen folds her arms. Let me guess. Another baseless accusation? Actually, I pull out my phone and tap the screen. I found your security footage. The room goes dead silent that Karen's smug expression wavers. Just for a second, I turn the screen around, pressing play. The video isn't perfect, but it's clear enough. The smoking gun, there she is. Karen, clear as day, sneaking into my yard under the cover of night. Dressed in all black, like some kind of suburban supervillain, snatching Gus from his spot and scurrying back across the street like a raccoon caught in a trash bin. The crowd gasps. A few people snicker that Karen's face turns an impressive shade of red. That could be anyone. Sure, I say, smirking. But it gets better. See, you were smart enough to delete your own footage. But the Patel family security camera. I turn the phone, revealing another angle. Karen, clear as day, clutching Gus like he's the last loaf of bread in a war zone. She stumbles over her words. I was just returning him. I finished for her. At 2 in the morning, in all black, with gloves on. A few people outright laugh. Her eyes dart around, looking for backup, but even Richard, her biggest supporter, is leaning away from her now. No one wants to go down with her. This is ridiculous, she shrieks. It's just a stupid gnome. I fold my arms. Then why'd you steal it? She opens her mouth, closes it, then glares at me like it's somehow my fault she got caught. I was doing a neighborhood a favor, she snaps. We have standards. And your yard, your house, it doesn't fit. We don't want people like you lowering our property values. Silence. The mask is off. Karen realizes her mistake the second it leaves her mouth. But it's too late. The whispers start. The murmurs. Even the people who tolerated her nonsense shift uncomfortably. She stammers. I didn't mean it like that. But she did. And now, everyone knows it. I step forward, my voice calm. Well, Karen, you'll be happy to know I'm fixing that problem. She glares at me. What are you talking about? I grin. I'm making a few improvements of my own. Since you care so much about neighborhood aesthetics, I figured you'd love to see the new addition I'm working on. Her eyes narrow. What addition? I lean in slightly. You'll see. Tomorrow. And just like that, I turn on my heel and walk out. The tables have turned. Now, it's my move. Karen's rattled. I see it in the way she storms out of the HOA meeting, her carefully rehearsed superiority crumbling under the weight of public humiliation. She doesn't look at anyone, doesn't acknowledge the hushed murmurs trailing behind her. She knows she messed up, but Karen isn't the type to accept defeat. No, she's the kind of person who doubles down. And I'm counting on it. The next morning, the big reveal of the sun barely crests over the horizon when I get the call. She's losing it. It's Mrs. Patel from across the street. Her voice practically giddied at I step outside just in time to see Karen standing in her yard, face twisted in outrage, pointing at her house like she just saw it for the first time. Only it doesn't look like her house anymore. Because last night, while she was busy licking her wounds, I was busy making my next move that I turned her property into a full-blown gnome museum. There are hundreds of them, gnomes of every size, shape, and color, lining her porch, peeking out from her flower beds. Some even perched on the roof like little stone gargoyles. And the best part? A massive wooden sign staked right in her front lawn. Welcome to the Karen Memorial Gnome Museum, a celebration of suburban pettiness. The neighborhood is already awake, phones out, snapping pictures. A few people are outright laughing. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who usually hates everything, gives me a thumbs up from his porch that Karen's face is a dangerous shade of red. "You can't do this," she shrieks, wheeling around to face me. "This is harassment. Vandalism." I fold my arms calm. "Oh, I didn't touch your house, Karen. Everything is on public property. Well, except for the ones in your yard. But those were all donations from the neighborhood." Her eyes widen. "What?" I smirk. "You heard me." Turns out, people had a lot of extra gnomes lying around. Karen looks around wildly, as if expecting someone to step in and put an end to this. But no one does, because, for once, the neighborhood isn't on her side. Then she tries a different tactic. "I'm calling the police," she huffs, pulling out her phone. "You're all trespassing." I shrug. "Go ahead." But before you do, I pull out my own phone and hit play. The final nail in the coffin. Karen's own voice echoes through the speakers. "We don't want people like you lowering our property values." Silenced at a few gasps ripple through the crowd. Karen goes stiff, her fingers still hovering over her phone screen that I tilt my head. "I recorded the whole thing last night, in case you try to twist the narrative." Karen's mouth opens, closes. "That was taken out of context." I keep my voice even. "Then let's play the whole thing, shall we?" I hit another button, and suddenly, her entire speech from the HOA meeting plays at full volume. Every racist, entitled word, there's no escaping it now. Karen looks around, desperate, her gaze darting toward the HOA board members. But even they're backing away now, distancing themselves. Then, as if things couldn't get worse, a sleek black SUV pulls up to the curb. When HOA rules backfire, the door swings open, and out steps a city zoning inspector, sent in response to a complaint that Karen's complaint. Her face goes pale as he approaches. "Ma'am, are you the one who submitted multiple complaints about a neighbor violating aesthetic standards?" Karen blinks rapidly. "Yes." Finally, someone who... The inspector holds up a clipboard, flipping through it. "Interesting, because after reviewing the HOA bylaws, it seems your own property has quite a few violations." Karen's eyes nearly pop out of her skull. "What? No, that's ridiculous." But he's already pointing at her porch. "That wreath? It's outside the approved seasonal display period. That mailbox? Not HOA compliant." And he gestures toward the Gnome Museum. "This excessive display could be considered an unauthorized decorative structure." I swear I hear someone choke on a laugh. Karen sputters. But I didn't put those there." The inspector raises an eyebrow. "So, you're saying someone put decorations on your property without your permission?" Her mouth slams shut, because if she admits that, then she'd also be admitting to stealing Gus. "You have 24 hours to remove any violations before fines are issued." The inspector continues. "If not, the HOA may be subject to further penalties." And just like that, the trap snaps shut. Karen's entire world implodes. The board members murmur amongst themselves. The neighbors are still recording. And Karen? She looks like she's going to explode. Her fingers twitch like she wants to scream, but she knows she lost it. I step forward, lowering my voice just enough so only she hears. "Maybe next time, don't steal from your neighbors. And definitely don't let your mask slip in public." She glares at me, shaking, but she says nothing, because at this moment, Karen is powerless. And I just turned her into the biggest joke in the neighborhood. Karen doesn't even try to fight back anymore. Not when the city inspector hands her a formal violation notice in front of the entire neighborhood. Not when the HOA board, now in full damage control mode, starts discussing a recall election without her. And certainly not when the video of her racist tirade hits the internet that evening, spreading like wildfire. BY morning, her name is all over the local news. HOA President caught on racist rant. Backlash grows. Homeowners call for immediate removal after discriminatory comments. People like you, the HOA president who destroyed her own reputation. She loses everything in a matter of hours. Public humiliation and fallout. Karen tries to salvage her reputation, of course. She issues some half-hearted apology on social media, claiming her words were misconstrued. But the damage is done. Sponsors pull funding from the HOA. Real estate agents refuse to list homes under Karen's leadership. Board members start resigning, one by one. By the end of the week, she's forced to step down. And that's not even the worst of it. A deep dive into the HOA's finances reveals several questionable expenses, funds mysteriously disappearing under Karen's management. The authorities start sniffing around, and it doesn't take long before a full-blown fraud investigation is launched. She could be facing serious charges, Mrs. Patel whispers one morning, watching from her porch as Karen's car is towed for unpaid tickets. Poetic justice. Reclaiming peace. As for me, I get Gus back. The HOA is too busy imploding to enforce its no large animals rule anymore. And even if they did, I have legal documentation proving I own this land outright. No one is kicking me off my own property. Gus prances around the yard that morning, snorting happily, completely oblivious to the chaos he helped expose. Guess you really are the neighborhood's little hero, I say, scratching his ears. The neighborhood itself seems different now. People are more open, more aware. Neighbors who once stayed silent speak up, condemning Karen's behavior. Some even apologize, admitting they turned a blind eye to her tactics for too long. We should have said something sooner, one of the older board members tells me. She ruled through fear, and we let her. That won't happen again. It's not perfect, but it's a start. A final message. The last time I see Karen, she's moving out. Her house, now unsellable thanks to her own self-destruction, sits empty and neglected. A stark contrast to the power she once held over this place. She doesn't look at me as she shoves a suitcase into the back of a rental car. But I don't need her to. She knows I won. And as I watch her drive away, leaving behind the very neighborhood she tried to control, I take a deep breath, a breath free of her entitlement, her prejudice, her abuse of power. Because justice tastes a lot like fresh, crisp morning air.